School choice was dealt a blow in Kentucky when Amendment 2 went down in flames on Election Day. By nearly a 2-to-1 margin, voters rejected the idea that Kentucky parents should have some kind of choice in education. The defeat was engineered by teacher union deception and misinformation about the amendment, and it was funded by the National Education Association. But was defeat of Amendment 2 good for Kentucky? Big education hasn't delivered when it comes to the success of Kentucky students, as we are near the bottom in education performance in K through 12. Joining us to talk about big education is Howard Husock, a senior fellow in domestic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on municipal government, urban housing policy, civil society, and philanthropy. He's been widely published in policy journals and the popular press, including outlets like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. He's also the author of a 2021 report entitled The Case for Breaking Up Big Urban School Systems, which is the topic of our conversation today. Howard, welcome to the Commonwealth Matters.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Hey, as we talked about just before we jumped on the air, we talked about Amendment 2 being on the ballot here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Kentucky is one of two states that has no form of school choice as a matter of public policy. It's Kentucky and North Dakota. And this amendment went down in flames, as I mentioned. Many of the voters, like I said, were misinformed, misled. The amendment was called a voucher amendment. The messaging was that if it passes, it's going to destroy our public schools. Teachers are going to lose their jobs. It's a measure that helps the rich. The rural areas aren't going to benefit from it. Accusation after accusation, many of them false. And this was funded largely by the National Education Association, the largest teachers union in the country. They dropped about $5.6 million to defeat Amendment 2. Last election reporting figures I saw showed about $8 million were spent to defeat Amendment 2. And again, a good chunk of that, about nearly two-thirds was by the NEA. Howard, you're not a real big fan of teachers unions. And it's not just because they're unions, but because of the results that they deliver and maybe the wrong incentives that they have behind that. Can you speak to that a little bit more as far as their political involvement in particular?
Well, I think my report focused on 2021 when we were in the COVID pandemic and some school districts stayed open and some school districts remained closed and remote for a very long time. And typically the ones that remained closed and had what we know in retrospect to be severe learning loss that we're still trying to recover from were the big city school systems where the unions have outsized power because, it's just simple arithmetic. If you can shut down New York City school system, which has almost 1 million students, you're very powerful versus shutting down a small suburban school district where the impact is going to be modest and local. And so just the fact that unions have greater representation in larger jurisdictions gives them an ability to cast their shadow and project their interests in a big way. But as you said, I'm not anti-union. I think unions have their place. My concern is learning. And if you have the largest district in Kentucky and so many districts around the country have lower income, disadvantaged neighborhoods where proficiencies in English and math are running at 20%, that's a threat to our country. That's a threat to the livelihoods and futures of those students. And so we just have to be open to all sorts of ideas that could address that problem. And it could be charter schools, it could be vouchers, or it could be just having smaller school districts where there's more accountability, which was the subject of my paper.
Yeah. I think you hit on something important, and it's about that young kids are being educated, right? That should be a priority. We want to see our kids thrive. We want to see them educated. It's their futures at stake, but also the future of the country. If you have an uneducated populace that cannot read or write or understands basic history or basic civics, that's a problem. And you have school districts largely in the bigger metro areas in the country that have seriously underperforming schools. Here in Kentucky, in Jefferson County, which is Louisville, you have really on the west end of Louisville, the inner city, you have schools that are terribly failing our kids. And the school choice movement in Kentucky has largely come from the inner city. Parents who want more choices and more options for their kids. Their kids are in third and fourth grade, and they're not reading. I think at the fourth grade level in Jefferson County, it's about a 20% reading proficiency rate. That means that 80% of fourth graders are not reading at grade level. And Howard, if kids aren't reading by the fourth grade, they're way behind. When I was going to school, you were expected to be able to read at the end of first grade. Even though it was the Dick and Jane books, I know I'm dating myself, but that's what we read. Dick and Jane, see spot, run. We learned the phonics, the phonetic approach to reading, but we were expected to learn to read by the end of first grade. And today it's been bumped up to third grade. And now the latest NAEP scores show that in Jefferson County, kids are only 20% are reading at grade level. And that's a problem.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that school choice is a panacea for low proficiency or there is any panacea, but I think probably Kentuckians would be surprised to know that in New York City, which is obviously a very liberal political jurisdiction, there are more than 200 charter schools. They're all publicly funded, and they have 100,000 students. That's a very large school system within a school system. Now, they're not all successful, but some of them have shown outsized success. There's one called the Success Academies. Their proficiency scores rival the top suburban school districts in the state, and their students are all low-income minority students. So it can be done. It can be done. Why do we want to rule out that kind of approach? It's not to say it always works, but why do we want to rule it out?
When you have failing schools, low test scores, it's time to get pragmatic and to look at ways to help increase student success and to bump those test scores up. And yet the teachers union across the country and here in Kentucky in particular has opposed anything that could be seen as the way that they put it here, taking away money from public schools. Howard, I want to go to the report that you wrote in 2021. That was following the COVID shutdowns of schools across the country. Your report was called "The Case for Breaking Up Big Urban School Systems." What led to you writing this report?
Well, I think what leads me to write it is the difference. At the time, the immediate impetus was the difference in reaction to the pandemic and locking down and potential learning loss from suburban districts compared to urban districts. And so that presented itself as an unusual difference right there. But more broadly, the going back, I think people are probably unaware that in 1939, there were 113,000 school districts in the United States. And today there are 13,000. We've consolidated school districts, bunched them all together in the name of efficiency. But somehow our proficiency is not being realized. And so what's gone wrong? And there's the idea that school choice is always about vouchers or charters. Well, no, it can be about small jurisdictions competing with each other to do the best they can. So very famously, in the Boston area, Boston's a pretty big city, but it's a very small part of the whole metro area. 3.5 million people live there, only about 600,000 in the city. And the rest of the metro area is a patchwork of small independent school districts with their own taxpayer and state support. And great research that was done by a Stanford University professor named Carolyn Hoxby showed that their scores are improved because they compete with each other. You choose where you live. So where do I want to live? People think about where do they want to live based on what the school is doing there. And you just have more choices, not because of vouchers, not because of charters, just because of more small school districts.
Yeah. Competition is a good thing, isn't it? In every other thing, whether it's the service, the restaurants, we've got, when there are restaurants competing, it's good. It's going to increase the quality of the food and the quality of the service. When it comes to retail goods, it's good to have competition. But when it comes to schools, that's not the prevailing mindset. Definitely not with the unions. Howard, one of your key points in your report is that you say that the politics of school reopening during the pandemic brought this into the national spotlight, the outsized role that teachers' unions play in managing the big cities. I want to go back to New York. How did New York City find itself in a place where they have charter schools, 200 charter schools, funded with public tax dollars? I mean, was the union somehow on board with that, or tell us how that happened or how they overcame that hurdle?
It was Mayor Michael Bloomberg and a school's chancellor named Joel Klein, and they took it as their mission to bring school choice to New York City. And so a Republican turned independent turned Democrat opened all those schools, and a Republican governor, George Pataki, in the late 90s, signed the legislation to create the charter school concept at all. But then Mayor Bloomberg expanded on that tremendously. But there are a lot of charter schools. They started first. The first charter schools were in Minnesota. There are a lot of charter schools in Massachusetts. So a lot of liberal political jurisdictions accept the idea that charter schools are a useful component to public education. They're not private. They're publicly funded.
Right. And yet they're still viewed as competition. At least some of the unions see them as competition. Now, in Kentucky, the state legislature has tried to break up Jefferson County public schools. The last couple of sessions, there's been a move, but they've not been able to do it. And in Jefferson County public schools, again, as we mentioned, they're not showing high student performance. They had the last 2 years in a row huge problems with busing, the bus routes, and mismanaging I mean, some kids were left or not brought home until like 10 o'clock in the evening last year. So we see low test scores. We see mismanagement in several areas. The state legislature has not been successful in breaking up the Jefferson County public school system. And I want to pause on the politics of this. That has been perceived as the state overstepping and getting involved with what should be a local issue. After all, they have a school board, and there are voters that can put school board members on there. How do you get past the political optic that it's the state that's micromanaging or getting involved with something that should be handled at the local level? How do you get past that political thing? Oh, and the other part too is that the legislature is controlled by Republicans. And the way that the teachers union has spun it is that this is Republicans who hate the schools and they're trying to micromanage us. How do you get past that political optic? Or maybe it's something you've not thought of, but I want to put that out there.
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I think the idea of doing what it takes to improve the student proficiency, that's an idealistic goal. It's not a self-interested goal. It's not a how do we help the rich goal. This is a problem for low-income students and their parents and their families. So I think, first of all, it has to be presented in that way. It's not how do we save money, how do we, get more money for the rich districts. It can't be anything like that, and it shouldn't be. Now, unless Kentucky is really different than most states, there's state aid, including state and federal aid that goes to the Jefferson County school district. So state legislators have an interest, just as the Congress has an interest in how Title IX, Title I funds are used by big city school districts. So they're not self-sufficient financially. And so the state legislature has a financial interest in this that is appropriate.
Yeah, very good. So that's the political dynamic that our legislature is trying to overcome. You make the case in your report that breaking up larger school districts into smaller independent ones brings about competition, like you just said. And it gives parents an option too. When there are smaller school districts, they can look at what district they want to move into. Many can, not all, and then send their kids to that one larger jurisdiction. You'd mentioned in New York, there was a mayor there that had the political will to bring school choice into that community. Is this what it's going to take for Louisville? Are you going to need a mayor that has some political muscle that he can flex to say, hey, we need some choices here?
Well, leadership matters, right? And so selling the idea matters. Persuading matters. And it's got to be sold as this is better for students. It can't be this is better for parents who want to insulate themselves from the poor. That's no good. It's got to be what's better for the students who are not performing well now. And to me, that's a bipartisan kind of an impulse that ought to be framed and ought to be a good political sell. Now, another point I think to be made, and in this regards the busing fiascos that you talked about and the kids left on the curb. The reason that's less likely to happen, and I assume that outside of Jefferson County, you've got a lot of small school districts in Kentucky. I'm guessing they don't have the same busing fiascos there. And that's because the relationship, it's at a smaller scale. It's local. The buses don't have complicated routes that are going all over the metro area, right? And the parents know where the bus stops are and they can go meet their kids there as needed. And so the idea that you create more efficiency by merging districts into big super districts, that's disproven by fiascos like that busing fiasco that you talked about.
Kentucky is at a crossroads. We can choose to give in to the radical left, or we can choose to engage the culture in a God-honoring way.
I started the Commonwealth Policy Center because I believe that Christians have a responsibility to influence government and society to the glory of God. While the Commonwealth Policy Center's made a significant impact, our work isn't finished. If you'd like to join our movement working for timeless values, then head to our website.
To learn more, go to commonwealthpolicycenter.org.
If you're just tuning in, you are listening to the Commonwealth Matters. I'm Richard Nelson, your host, with Howard Husock, Senior Fellow in Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Howard, the parents in Jefferson County have voiced support for options and school choice for their kids for several years. But they don't have the political organization. They don't have the funding that the teachers union has, Jefferson County Public Teachers Association. When it came to realigning the school board right after the 2020 COVID shutdown of the public schools, more parents were aware of what was being taught in the classroom. Of course, as they were doing virtual learning, parents were aware of the curriculum and some of the things that were being taught there. They became aware of some of the radical things, that gender ideology that was pushed. And I recall in one situation where when this came to light, there were some parents that approached the school board and said, hey, we don't think that these things should be available in our schools. The school board pushed back. There was a big election after that. And the teachers union funded the pro-union school board members and defeated those who were just more parents-based, more accountability-based, defeated every one of them. And it's because the parent-based school board members, and that's the term I guess I'll use, they didn't have the money to compete with the teachers union. What I'm getting to and what we've been talking about here is just the outsized impact that the teachers union has had in Jefferson County, the sway that they've had, the funding advantage that they've had. There hasn't been political will in Jefferson County to bring school choice there. Even though the voices are there, there just hasn't been enough momentum to get it moving. And I know I'm belaboring this point, but what's it going to take for Kentucky to have school choice, or for, I guess, starting in Jefferson County, for Jefferson County to get school choice? I guess buy-in. I mean, maybe we need to sit down at the table with teachers union leaders, or with the teachers there. Where do we even start with this? Because it has hit a dead end for several years, maybe a decade or so, as there's been a clamoring for school choice. It's not going anywhere. And so long as that teachers union is in place, able to spend the money, get their candidates elected to the school board, control the messaging, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen.
Well, I think a couple of things. It's got to be sold well. Got to be sold well as an idealistic alternative, because that's what it is. But second, your point about being outspent, that's why the smaller districts are so important. It's not that the smaller districts don't have union representation, but there's a balance. If there's 10,000 students or 100,000 students in the district, each parent is one of a large number, and the teachers unions are a large group. If there's 1,000 students in the district, each vote by those parents matters more, right, as a portion of the electorate. And so there's a greater balance in smaller districts between the power of parents and the power of organized groups of any kind. And so that's why I look to the smaller district, the deconsolidation, reverse consolidation, as maybe a less objectionable way than saying we're going to have vouchers or charter schools. So I think that could be a middle ground, perhaps, to have smaller districts with greater parental control. And by the way, in the poorer neighborhoods, those parents would be empowered by having their own school board, right? Their own chance to oversee their kids in their schools. They wouldn't be looking at a faraway school board where their vote is one of so many and is diluted. And so it's really in the interest. It's not in the interest of the rich people. They already have the good schools. We're talking about poor households with low-performing students who are being consigned to potential lifetimes of poverty. This is an outrage, and so we have to understand that in the West End of Louisville, you'll have your own school board. You might have 5 school boards. That's a chance for people to have their own political careers, the chance to express their opinions, to have different kinds of curriculum. It's empowering to have smaller school districts where the parents are the ones in charge. And that's the goal of breaking up the district. And I hope that those in the state legislature in Frankfurt who are interested in this can sell it in that kind of way.
Howard, I'm inspired by what you're saying. I'm all in. You've convinced me that this is the way to go. Maybe we can get you to come to Louisville and talk about the benefits of breaking up the huge Jefferson County public school system. Here's my question. Are you aware of other large school districts that have been broken up into smaller districts where parents have a greater voice and greater influence, and where parents can run for the school board, and where it's turned the system around? Do we have any examples like this across the country?
Well, what there has been is a lot of new municipalities that get formed or incorporated. It's very hard. It's proven difficult to break up. Clark County, Nevada, Las Vegas, tried really hard to break up that school district, and they had to go through the state legislature. The politics didn't work out for them. But it was an organized movement in the largest school district in Nevada. So people are working on this. But what's more common, of course, is for there to be a profusion of smaller school districts outside the inner cities. And since, the 1920s, consolidation is not happening there. They recognize that they've got a good thing. And so consolidation was a brief moment in most parts of the country. And in other parts of the country, people are sticking with the smaller districts. And that's the norm.
Okay, that's good. In a 2021 article for a publication called Education Next, you say that breaking up school districts into smaller pieces would not reverse gains realized by the labor movement. Public sector employees would still be able to negotiate contracts with school districts. Now, one of the main arguments that teachers union has against breaking up the school districts is that it might somehow negatively affect teacher pay. Can you point to any research that indicates that teacher pay would not be decreased, or their benefits would be decreased if their district was broken up and put into smaller districts?
Well, some of the highest paid teachers in the country are in suburbs of New York, Chicago, Boston. So small districts doesn't mean teachers can't be well paid. Now, I think the unions have a point. If you have small districts with limited property tax bases, you are going to have state aid that will reflect the difference in their property tax base. And so it's not like it's a magic bullet. You do have to think about, are they going to be able to pay to attract the talent that they need? And that's where the state needs to step in, and the districts with more resources may not need the same level of state aid. And so we have to make sure that we keep our eyes on equity as it regards to funding for those that have new districts that might have small tax bases.
It's very good. Very good. Howard, this has been a great conversation. Perhaps this will help jumpstart what the legislature has talked about in the past, but maybe it'll jumpstart in the 2025 session to look again at breaking up larger school districts to bring about more parental involvement, to increase their voices, and more accountability within smaller districts. Do you have any suggestion for the legislature? Let's say that you were going to advise them, and you've given some great advice, which we're going to share this with legislators as well once we have this, once this program comes out. But would you add anything else that if you were speaking to the Kentucky State Legislature, would you add anything else to this as to how to go about breaking up the large school district?
Well, I think there has been a commission of some sort, as I understand it, but I think you need to have a variety of blueprints. So you've got to, I think, the chance to see what it would actually be like. In theory, it might sound, like a bridge too far. But let's say, well, here are the blueprints. There are going to be 4 districts. This is what they're going to be. These are the geographic borders. These are the property tax bases. This is how the state is going to manage their existing debt, and they have debt from capital bonding. And so I think if you can have the state legislature draft a series of alternative plans for 4 districts, 6 districts, 8 districts, to make sure that the poor aren't over-concentrated in any one district. If parents could actually see what it would be like, that you would be closer to the schools, that the selective district-wide schools were not going to be abolished. Figure out how to sell it by actually putting the concept into brass tacks.
Howard, this has been great to have you on the program. Hopefully this will be a help to policymakers and just the regular Kentuckians who want to learn more about what happens when a school district is broken up, the potential benefits that are there. Would you like to add anything else before we close it out?
Louisville is a great city. It ought to have a great school system.
Very good. Howard Husock of the American Enterprise Institute, thank you so much for joining us on the Commonwealth Matters. God bless and keep up the good work.
Great. Thanks for having me, Richard.